The scent of freshly mown grass hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sweet perfume of honeysuckle. It was a typical summer morning in Willow Creek, 1975, the kind where the sun felt warm on your skin and the day promised endless possibility. 7-year-old Emily Brown, a whirlwind of boundless energy and infectious giggles, was already dressed in her favorite denim overalls, a vibrant butterfly clip holding back her bouncy brown curls. Her plans were simple, as all good summer plans should be: a visit to her best friend Sarah's house, just 2 blocks down the street, for an epic session of hopscotch and lemonade. She'd promised Sarah she'd be there by 9, a pinky promise sealed with a solemn nod and a shared secret smile. Her mother, busy with breakfast, had called out a gentle reminder to be careful, a common refrain in a town where unlocked doors and unsupervised play were still the norm. Emily waved a cheerful goodbye, her small, worn sneakers already hitting the sun-dappled sidewalk. 2 blocks. It wasn't far, a familiar stretch of tree-lined street she'd navigated countless times. But 9 o'clock came and went. Then 9:30. Sarah's mother, initially unconcerned, felt a prickle of unease. Emily, always punctual, always so full of life, hadn't arrived. The quiet hum of the summer morning slowly began to transform into something else entirely. A chilling, unnerving silence that screamed of a broken promise and a missing child. And so, the haunting tale of Emily Brown begins. Stay with us until the very end to uncover the truth hidden for decades. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? The gentle apprehension of Sarah's mother soon blossomed into a cold, hard fear. She made the first call, a tentative query to Emily's house, her voice laced with an anxiety that she tried, unsuccessfully, to mask. Emily's mother, initially calm, her internal clock ticking off the seconds, began to feel the first shivers of dread. A quick search of the backyard, the nearby park, even the familiar route to Sarah's house, yielded nothing but silence. The neighborhood, usually bustling with the sounds of children at play, now felt eerily still. Word spread quickly, a whispered contagion through Willow Creek. Neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces etched with concern, joining the impromptu search. Familiar faces, who had just hours before exchanged pleasantries and discussed garden plans, now moved with a desperate urgency, calling out Emily's name, their voices growing hoarse. The sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving, as hope slowly began to recede. Then, just as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a scream tore through the quiet air, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to shatter the very fabric of the peaceful summer day. It came from the overgrown edge of town, near an old, dilapidated barn that had long been a forbidden playground for the neighborhood children. A man, a local farmer who had joined the search, stumbled out of the darkness of the barn's interior, his face ashen, his eyes wide with unspeakable horror. He didn't need to speak. The town knew. Inside, amidst the dust and cobwebs, lay the tiny, lifeless form of Emily Brown. Her bright overalls were disheveled, her butterfly clip missing, and a single chilling detail confirmed the unspeakable: the faint, telltale bruising on her neck. The innocence of Willow Creek had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a collective gasp of disbelief and an overwhelming wave of grief. The idyllic summer morning had ended in an unimaginable nightmare. The wail of sirens pierced the bucolic calm, announcing the arrival of flashing lights that painted the quiet street in stark hues of red and blue. Uniformed officers, their faces grim, quickly secured the scene around the dilapidated barn, their movements precise and practiced, yet tinged with a visible solemnity that spoke volumes of the horror they encountered. Detectives, their expressions hardened by years of confronting humanity's darker side, arrived shortly after, their eyes scanning every inch of the makeshift crime scene. Each fallen leaf, every disturbed blade of grass, held the potential to whisper a secret. Emily's small body, so recently alive with childish joy, was meticulously examined, photographed, and carefully removed, a heartbreaking and sterile procedure. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, a collective silence descending as the gravity of what had happened settled over Willow Creek. The initial hours of the investigation were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The medical examiner's report confirmed the community's worst fears. Emily had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The brutality of the act sent a fresh wave of shock and revulsion through Willow Creek, transforming grief into a simmering rage. Investigators, methodical and relentless, fanned out across the neighborhood, their clipboards and stern questions, a jarring intrusion into the familiar rhythm of daily life. Parents, still reeling from the news, were subjected to probing interviews, their every movement and word scrutinized. Her two older brothers, their youthful innocence irrevocably scarred, recounted the morning's mundane events, their voices barely above a whisper. Neighbors, their faces pale and drawn, offered what little they knew, recalling Emily's cheerful wave, the familiar sight of her skipping down the sidewalk. No one remembered anything out of the ordinary, no strange cars, no suspicious figures. The familiar routine of a summer day had, seemingly, dissolved into thin air, taking Emily with it. The route Emily was supposed to have taken, just 2 short blocks, became the focal point of the early search. Every bush, every patch of tall grass, every backyard shed along that stretch was meticulously combed. Law enforcement, aided by a surge of desperate volunteers, meticulously searched house by house, garden by garden, as if the missing pieces of the puzzle might simply be lying in plain sight. They spoke to milkmen, mail carriers, delivery drivers, anyone who might have been in the vicinity that morning. Yet, despite their exhaustive efforts, no witnesses emerged who could shed light on Emily's disappearance. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air between her front door and Sarah's. The initial leads, few as they were, quickly dried up. There were no clear footprints, no discarded items, no discernible DNA evidence visible to the technology of 1975 that could point a finger at the perpetrator. The immediate area around the barn offered no further clues. It was a dumping ground for forgotten junk, its disturbed earth telling no singular story. Panic began to ripple through the close-knit community. Whispers spread like wildfire. Could it have been someone we know, our neighbor, the man down the street? Parents, once comfortable, letting their children play freely, now gripped their hands tightly, their eyes constantly scanning, their hearts pounding with a new, unwelcome fear. Playdates were canceled, bicycles remained in garages, and the joyful shouts of summer faded into a somber quiet. Willow Creek, once a beacon of small-town tranquility, found itself shrouded in a palpable atmosphere of fear and profound sorrow. The funeral for Emily Brown was a stark, heartbreaking affair, the church overflowing with grieving families, friends, and strangers, united in their despair. The small white casket was a stark, painful symbol of a life brutally cut short. Tears flowed freely, questions echoed, unanswered, and the palpable sense of injustice hung heavy in the air. The local newspapers carried heart-wrenching headlines recounting the final kiss from Emily's mother before the casket lid was closed, words that twisted stomachs and brought tears to even the most hardened readers. The collective anguish was immense, but understanding remained elusive. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child, and why? As weeks turned into months, the initial flurry of police activity gradually subsided. The leads had run cold, the well of information seemingly dry. Without new evidence, without a suspect, the case slid into a grim stalemate. The killer, it seemed, had melted into the shadows, leaving behind only devastation and a profound sense of injustice. The question, why, haunted not only Emily's grieving family, but every officer who had worked the case. As winter's cold embrace settled over Willow Creek, so too did a chilling silence fall upon Emily's case. It became a cold case, frozen in time, a silent testament to an unsolved tragedy. Decades would pass, fading memories and collecting dust. But the truth, though buried, would not be forgotten. The silence, however, was deafening, and for years, Willow Creek remained a town haunted by an unanswerable question. Decades crawled by, each year layering dust upon the unsolved mystery of Emily Brown. The vibrant hues of 1975 faded into the sepia tones of memory, and the initial shock and outrage in Willow Creek slowly ossified into a quiet ache, a communal scar that never quite healed. Emily's name, once on every lip, became a hushed whisper, largely confined to the private grief of her family. Witnesses aged, their memories blurring around the edges, and the physical evidence, painstakingly collected, lay dormant in police archives, seemingly destined to remain untouched. It truly seemed as though the truth, like Emily herself, was forever lost beneath the relentless march of time. But the world was changing rapidly and profoundly. The dawn of the 21st century ushered in an era of technological marvels, pushing the boundaries of forensic science far beyond what could have been imagined in the mid-1970s. In 2018, a new wave of cold case initiatives swept across the nation, driven by advancements in DNA analysis that promised to unlock secrets previously thought impenetrable. Prosecutors and law enforcement agencies, armed with these revolutionary tools, began revisiting the most intractable cases, hoping to bring closure to families who had endured decades of agonizing uncertainty. Among the myriad of cold cases pulled from dusty shelves was that of Emily Brown. A young, ambitious detective, Sarah Miller, new to the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department, but deeply committed to justice, stumbled upon Emily's file during an internal review. The sheer volume of the original investigation, a thick, yellow dossier filled with handwritten notes, faded photographs, and painstakingly documented but ultimately fruitless leads, spoke volumes of the initial efforts. Yet what truly struck Detective Miller was the heartbreaking absence of closure, the silence that followed such a horrific crime. She saw not just a file, but a 7-year-old girl frozen in time whose story demanded a resolution. With renewed vigor and the blessing of her superiors, Detective Miller championed the re-examination of Emily's case. The most crucial pieces of evidence, fragments of Emily's clothing, particularly a small piece of fabric found clutched in her hand, and several strands of hair discovered near her body, were carefully retrieved from their long-term storage. These items, once analyzed with the rudimentary techniques of the 1970s, were now destined for a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory, equipped with the latest advancements in DNA sequencing. The anticipation within the small department was palpable. This was their chance, perhaps the only chance to finally give Emily and her family the answers they deserved. Weeks turned into an agonizing wait as the samples underwent rigorous testing. The microscopic bits of biological material, once invisible to the naked eye and unreadable by earlier technology, were now subjected to powerful amplification techniques designed to extract even the faintest genetic signature. The results, when they finally arrived, were a mixture of exhilaration and crushing disappointment. A full DNA profile belonging to an unknown male was successfully extracted from the evidence. It was a monumental breakthrough, confirming the presence of the perpetrator's biological material at the scene. This genetic blueprint, a silent witness from the past, was meticulously uploaded into the National DNA Index System, NDIS, a vast federal database containing DNA profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scene evidence. The team held its breath, fingers crossed, as the system churned, comparing the newly acquired profile against millions of others. Every second felt like an eternity, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. No match, not a single hit. The collective sigh of disappointment in the detective's office was almost audible. It meant one of two things. Either the killer had never been arrested for a crime that required his DNA to be collected and entered into the system, or he was no longer alive, his profile therefore absent from the active database. The initial surge of hope, so potent just moments before, quickly evaporated, replaced by a familiar, bitter taste of frustration. The case, it seemed, had hit yet another dead end, leaving Emily's mystery as entrenched as ever, a phantom in the annals of Willow Creek's history. The silence after such a brief, hopeful interruption seemed heavier than before. The crushing disappointment of the NDIS search, while a setback, did not extinguish the flickering flame of hope for Detective Miller. She refused to let Emily's case slide back into the cold storage of forgotten crimes. The extracted DNA profile, though unmatched in criminal databases, was still a powerful key, a unique biological fingerprint of the killer. The question was, how to use it? Traditional law enforcement methods had reached their limit. The years had silenced witnesses, obscured memories, and erased conventional tracks. What was needed was an unconventional approach, something that leveraged the very essence of human connection, family. It was during a late-night research session, fueled by strong coffee and an unyielding determination, that Detective Miller stumbled upon an emerging field, investigative genetic genealogy. This revolutionary technique involved uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogical databases, the same ones millions of ordinary people used to trace their family trees and connect with long-lost relatives. The idea was audacious, almost outlandish to the traditional police mindset. It hinged on the premise that if the killer, or a close relative, had voluntarily submitted their DNA to such a database, a match, or at least a strong familial link, could be found. It was a long shot, fraught with ethical considerations and legal complexities, but it offered a glimmer of possibility where none had existed before. While navigating the bureaucratic hurdles and seeking the necessary legal permissions to proceed with this novel approach, Detective Miller's path unexpectedly intersected with that of Adam Greenwood. Adam, a 20-year-old student at a local university, was an unassuming figure, often found hunched over a laptop, immersed in the intricate world of ancestral charts and DNA markers. His passion for genealogy, sparked by a childhood fascination with his own family history, had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how genetic information could illuminate complex familial relationships across generations. He wasn't a detective, nor a forensic scientist, but a self-taught enthusiast, a digital Sherlock Holmes of lineage. Adam's initial encounter with Emily Brown's case was purely accidental. Scrolling through online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, a particularly poignant article caught his eye, a retrospective on the enduring agony of the Willow Creek tragedy. The accompanying faded photograph of a bright-eyed, smiling 7-year-old resonated deeply with him. He read about the initial investigation, the dead ends, the decades of silence. And then he read about the recent frustrating discovery of the unknown male DNA profile. A daring, almost impulsive thought sparked in his mind. What if I could help? He knew his skills weren't those of a seasoned detective, but he understood the vast potential of public DNA databases in connecting individuals through distant, shared ancestry. He had witnessed countless times how a single DNA match could unravel complex family trees, revealing previously unknown relatives. Could this same methodology, he wondered, be applied to identify a killer? It was an audacious proposition for someone so young, yet his conviction was unwavering. With a mix of trepidation and youthful confidence, Adam drafted an email to the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department. He carefully articulated his understanding of genetic genealogy, humbly acknowledging his lack of formal law enforcement experience, but passionately detailing how his unique expertise might offer a fresh perspective. He laid out his proposal to upload the unknown DNA profile to open-source genealogical databases and use his skills to build a family tree, not of victims or witnesses, but of the perpetrator himself. He anticipated skepticism, perhaps even outright dismissal. To his surprise, Detective Miller, intrigued by the unconventional nature of his proposal and desperate for any viable lead, agreed to meet him. Their first encounter took place not in a sterile police station, but in a bustling local coffee shop, a neutral ground for an unorthodox collaboration. Adam arrived prepared, his laptop open to complex genealogical charts, printouts of database comparisons, and a meticulously organized folder of case studies where genetic genealogy had led to breakthroughs. He spoke with a quiet intensity, his passion for the subject evident in every carefully chosen word. He didn't promise miracles, but he offered a meticulously researched methodology, a logical pathway through the genetic labyrinth. Detective Miller, observing his intelligence, his genuine desire to help, and the sheer depth of his knowledge, saw not just a student, but a potential ally. After thorough internal discussions and securing the necessary departmental approvals, often amidst raised eyebrows and muttered doubts from more traditional colleagues, Detective Miller secured a limited authorization for Adam to proceed. The legal and ethical considerations were paramount, particularly regarding privacy issues within public databases. The agreement was precise. Adam would work under strict supervision, adhering to all protocols, and his sole focus would be to provide familial leads, not direct identifications, which would remain the purview of traditional forensic methods. It was a leap of faith for the department, a venture into uncharted territory, but for Emily Brown's case, it represented the first true spark of hope in over 4 decades. The silence surrounding her fate, so long unbroken, now held the faintest promise of a whisper. With the limited authorization secured, Adam Greenwood plunged into his task with an almost obsessive focus, the gravity of Emily Brown's unsolved murder weighing heavily on his young shoulders. He understood the immense responsibility placed upon him, a responsibility usually reserved for seasoned investigators. This wasn't just a fascinating genealogical puzzle, it was a matter of decades-old justice. His makeshift office, a corner of his dorm room perpetually littered with textbooks and energy drink cans, transformed into a command center for his genetic quest. The first step was to upload the anonymous DNA profile, the one provided by Detective Miller, to several of the largest and most widely used open-source genealogical databases. These platforms, unlike the secure criminal databases, relied on voluntary submissions from millions of individuals eager to trace their lineage and connect with distant relatives. It was a vast, sprawling network of interconnected family trees, a digital map of humanity's genetic tapestry. Adam meticulously followed the strict protocols agreed upon with the police, ensuring the anonymity of the profile while maximizing its visibility for potential matches. He understood the ethical tightrope he was walking, the delicate balance between solving a horrific crime and respecting the privacy of individuals who had simply sought to learn about their ancestors. The initial results were, as expected, not a direct match to the perpetrator himself. Such a clear-cut hit was rare unless the killer had, for some inexplicable reason, submitted their own DNA to a public database. Instead, Adam received a long list of distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, even fifth cousins. These were people who shared small, fragmented segments of DNA with the unknown profile, indicating a common ancestor somewhere in their shared past, perhaps several generations back. For an untrained eye, this data would have been a bewildering jumble of names and percentages, but for Adam, it was a roadmap. He began the arduous, painstaking process of constructing a reverse genealogical tree. Starting from these distant matches, he worked backward through generations, meticulously researching family lines, cross-referencing public records, census data, obituaries, marriage licenses, and birth certificates. He spent countless hours poring over digital archives, historical newspapers, and local cemetery records. Each piece of information, however small, was a brushstroke on a vast, intricate canvas. He tracked migrations, identified key ancestors, and slowly but surely began to build the framework of a family that, at some point, had produced the individual whose DNA now sat before him. The process was slow, often tedious, and riddled with dead ends. False leads emerged, common names created confusion, and incomplete records posed frustrating obstacles. There were moments of despair, late nights spent staring at an intractable branch of a family tree, feeling the weight of 4 decades of unsolved mystery pressing down on him. But then, a breakthrough would occur. The discovery of a crucial marriage record, a forgotten will, or a newspaper clipping detailing a family reunion. and a new pathway would open. Each such victory, however small, renewed his determination. Slowly, painstakingly, a pattern began to emerge. Multiple distant matches consistently pointed back to specific regions, then to particular towns, and finally to a handful of interconnected families who had resided in the broader area surrounding Willow Creek for generations. This geographical convergence was a critical step, confirming that the perpetrator likely had deep roots in the very community where Emily's life had been so cruelly taken. It narrowed the vast, almost infinite possibilities down to a manageable, albeit still substantial, pool of individuals. Adam then began to meticulously map out these interconnected family lines. He focused on identifying individuals within these trees who would have been of a suitable age in 1975 to have committed the crime. This involved cross-referencing birth dates and death records, systematically eliminating those who were too young, too old, or had died prior to the murder. He also paid close attention to any family members who might have moved into or out of the Willow Creek area around that time, broadening his net just enough to catch any transient possibilities. Through this meticulous sifting, a distinct cluster of individuals began to crystallize within one particular family. This family, the Millers, no relation to Detective Miller, had a surprisingly dense presence in the area surrounding Willow Creek since the early 20th century. Adam felt a prickle of anticipation. He had found a lineage, a potential ancestral home for the unknown killer. The sheer volume of data he had processed, the thousands of names, dates, and locations he had synthesized, was finally beginning to yield a tangible focus. He now had not just a random DNA profile, but a family name, a history, and a geographical nexus that finally brought the elusive perpetrator a step closer to the light. The vast unknown was shrinking piece by painstaking piece, and the silhouette of Emily's killer was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to take shape within the shadows of a long-forgotten family tree. The Miller family, as Adam had now identified them through countless hours of meticulous genealogical work, represented the most promising lead in 4 decades. They were not a family steeped in infamy or marked by a history of violent crime. In fact, on the surface, they appeared unremarkable, an ordinary thread in the tapestry of American life. Yet, somewhere within their sprawling branches, a monster had lurked in 1975, and its genetic signature now pointed relentlessly to this lineage. Adam's task shifted from broad genealogical mapping to a more focused, almost surgical, investigation of individual lives within this specific family. He began by constructing detailed individual profiles for every male member of the Miller family who would have been between the ages of roughly 15 and 60 in 1975. This age range was a broad initial sweep, allowing for the possibility of a younger or older perpetrator than typical profiles might suggest. For each potential suspect, he delved into publicly accessible records, old phone directories, voter registrations, property deeds, and even digitized high school yearbooks. He searched for any mention of their residences in or around Willow Creek during the mid-1970s. The goal was to establish their geographical proximity to Emily Brown's home at the time of the murder. Some men were easily eliminated, those who had lived hundreds of miles away, or who were verifiably incarcerated or serving in the military overseas. Others, however, remained within the concentric circles of suspicion. One name in particular began to stand out with unnerving clarity: Jonathan Miller. Born in 1940, he would have been 35 years old in 1975, an age that fit the typical profile of a violent offender. Public records showed he had lived within a 10-mile radius of Willow Creek for most of his life, only moving out of the state in the late 1980s. More significantly, a quick search of old local newspapers, painstakingly digitized and cross-referenced by Adam, revealed a brief obituary for Jonathan Miller from 1995. He had died relatively young at 55, from what was listed as natural causes. The fact of his death, while seemingly a dead end, was, in fact, a crucial piece of the puzzle. It explained why his DNA profile had never appeared in the active NDIS database of living convicted felons. The killer, it seemed, had eluded justice not by cunning, but by the ultimate escape, death. But the discovery of Jonathan Miller's death didn't close the book. It merely opened a new, more profound chapter. Adam now focused his efforts almost entirely on Jonathan. He dug deeper, looking for any public records that might hint at a darker side. Jonathan Miller's public record on the surface was unremarkable. A high school graduate, he had worked a series of blue-collar jobs in Willow Creek, a mechanic, a factory worker, then a short stint in a local construction firm. There were no obvious red flags, no major criminal convictions that would have landed him in state prison where DNA samples would have been collected. He had been married twice, had 2 adult children living out of state, and seemed to have led an ordinary, if somewhat anonymous, life. However, as Adam sifted through the minutiae of Jonathan's past, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. He uncovered a few minor misdemeanor charges from the late 1960s: public intoxication, disorderly conduct. Not violent offenses, but they painted a picture of a man who occasionally struggled with impulse control, particularly under the influence of alcohol. More unsettling were fragmented pieces of information from old local police blotters, a report of a domestic disturbance at Jonathan's residence in the early 1970s, quickly dismissed, and a brief mention of a scuffle outside a local bar. These were whispers, not shouts, but they began to color the seemingly benign portrait of Jonathan Miller. Adam also delved into Jonathan's employment history around 1975. The records indicated a period of unemployment or sporadic employment during that year. This was a critical detail. A person without a fixed work schedule would have had more unstructured time, potentially allowing for the opportunity that a regularly employed individual might not have had. It was a speculative thread, but it added to the growing mosaic of circumstantial evidence pointing towards Jonathan. The most chilling revelation, however, came from an unexpected source, an archived local news snippet from a 1975 edition of the Willow Creek Gazette. It was a small, almost buried piece, overshadowed by the ongoing fervent coverage of Emily Brown's murder investigation. The article mentioned a temporary layoff at a local auto repair shop, Willow Creek Auto, due to a downturn in business. Jonathan Miller's name was listed among those temporarily affected. The auto shop, Adam discovered through old business directories, was located barely a mile and a half from Emily Brown's home. The significance of this hit Adam with the force of a physical blow. Jonathan Miller, a man whose DNA now potentially matched the killer, had not only lived in the area but had also experienced a sudden, unexpected period of unemployment and free time in the precise time frame of Emily's disappearance. This seemingly innocuous detail, overlooked in the original frantic investigation, now screamed with newfound importance. In 1975, the focus had been on immediate suspects, on tangible leads. The idea that a seemingly ordinary citizen whose family had deep roots in the community could be the monster was simply not within the common investigative paradigm without direct evidence. But now, armed with the cold, irrefutable logic of DNA and the meticulous reconstruction of a forgotten life, Adam had found his strongest link yet. The outline of the killer, once a blurry shadow, was now taking on a horrifying concrete form, its name etched into a newly discovered family tree, Jonathan Miller. The silence of the past was finally beginning to yield its secrets. Adam's discovery of Jonathan Miller's temporary layoff from Willow Creek Auto in 1975 was more than just a detail. It was a seismic shift in the investigation. It propelled Jonathan from a mere name on a complex family tree to the prime, albeit deceased, suspect. The innocuous newspaper clipping, buried in the digital archives of the local library, held the chilling weight of 43 years of silence. Adam knew he had to share this immediately with Detective Miller. The quiet hum of his dorm room was replaced by a frantic energy as he compiled his findings, eager to present this critical piece of information. When he finally laid out his research to Detective Miller, she listened with a growing intensity. her initial skepticism gradually replaced by a quiet awe. The sheer depth of Adam's genealogical dive, combined with his astute ability to connect seemingly disparate historical records, was beyond anything she had expected. He showed her the meticulously constructed family tree, highlighting Jonathan Miller's branch, then presented the old newspaper snippet, enlarged and circled. He pointed out the location of Willow Creek Auto on an old town map, demonstrating its close proximity to Emily's home. The picture emerging was clear and deeply disturbing. Here was a man with a genetic link to the crime, who had been physically present in the immediate vicinity and, crucially, had experienced an unexpected disruption in his routine at precisely the time Emily vanished. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator, recognized the significance of this confluence of factors. The temporary layoff provided not just opportunity, but also potential motive. For a man struggling with impulse control, as Jonathan's minor infraction suggested, sudden unemployment could have fueled frustration or despair, leading to reckless behavior. The fact that this detail had been overlooked in the original investigation was understandable, given the limitations of the time. In the chaotic aftermath of such a horrific crime, resources were stretched thin, and traditional detective work focused on immediate, tangible leads. Without the power of DNA to narrow the field, following every minor change in an individual's employment status was simply not feasible. Yet, there was still a missing link, definitive proof that the DNA found at the crime scene belonged to Jonathan Miller. The genealogical connection was strong, pointing to him and his immediate paternal line, but it wasn't an absolute match to the specific DNA profile extracted from Emily's clothing. The only way to achieve that was to obtain a direct DNA sample from Jonathan himself. And Jonathan Miller, as the records clearly stated, had been dead for over 2 decades. This presented a formidable challenge. To get a DNA sample from a deceased individual, an exhumation would be required. This was not a decision to be taken lightly. Exhumation was a highly sensitive and legally complex procedure requiring court orders, careful consideration of the deceased's family's feelings, and often public explanation. It was an intrusion into the final resting place, a disturbing of the peace, and could be deeply upsetting for surviving family members who would be forced to confront the possibility that their deceased relative was a brutal killer. Detective Miller presented Adam's findings and the necessity of an exhumation to her superiors. The police chief, initially hesitant due to the potential backlash and the cost involved, was ultimately swayed by the compelling nature of Adam's genetic evidence. The potential for finally solving Emily Brown's murder, a case that had haunted the department for generations, outweighed the logistical and public relations challenges. A formal request for a court order was initiated, citing the newly discovered genetic and circumstantial evidence that pointed directly to Jonathan Miller. The legal process unfolded with a deliberate slowness that felt agonizing to Adam and Detective Miller, who were both eager for answers. Lawyers for the Miller family, surprised and distressed by the sudden macabre interest in their deceased relative, initially resisted. They argued against the invasion of privacy, the unnecessary disturbance of a resting soul. But the weight of the evidence meticulously presented by the prosecution, the cold case DNA profile, the compelling genealogical links, and the critical detail of Jonathan's proximity and unemployment in 1975 eventually swayed the judge. After weeks of legal wrangling, the court issued the order. Jonathan Miller's remains were to be exhumed. The news reverberated through the now adult children of Jonathan Miller. For them, it was an unfathomable shock. Their father, a quiet, somewhat unremarkable man, was now being posthumously accused of a monstrous crime. The request to exhume his body ripped open old wounds and ignited a painful, internal conflict. Could this quiet man they knew as their father truly have been capable of such an atrocity? The shame, the confusion, and the sheer disbelief were overwhelming. Yet, faced with the undeniable legal order and the compelling nature of the evidence, and perhaps a faint, unsettling echo of something they couldn't quite place from their childhood, they ultimately relented, granting the authorities access to their father's grave. The quiet grave of Jonathan Miller, silent for over 2 decades, was about to surrender its darkest secret. The truth, long buried, was poised to finally surface. The sun beat down mercilessly on the quiet, manicured lawn of Willow Creek Cemetery, a stark contrast to the grim proceedings about to unfold. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath, their usual chirping replaced by the low hum of machinery and the hushed, almost reverent tones of the small group assembled. It was a somber tableau. Detective Sarah Miller, her face etched with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Adam Greenwood standing a respectful distance away, his usual academic composure replaced by a profound sense of solemnity. A grim-faced team from the medical examiner's office, and uniformed police officers maintaining a cordon, ensuring privacy for the difficult task ahead. The local news crews, alerted to the unusual activity, kept their distance, their cameras poised, understanding the gravity of the moment without needing to be told. The target of this macabre undertaking was a modest headstone, weathered by nearly 30 years of sun and rain, bearing the name Jonathan Miller, along with his birth and death dates. To the casual observer, it was just another grave, another life past. But for those gathered, it represented the potential key to unlocking a 43-year-old nightmare. The process began with quiet efficiency. The ground, softened by recent rains, gave way with a soft thud as the digging equipment, carefully operated, began its work. The initial scraping sounds were jarring in the otherwise silent cemetery, a raw intrusion into the peaceful sanctity of the dead. As the grave slowly deepened, the air grew heavy with unspoken questions, with the weight of decades of unanswered prayers and unresolved grief. For Detective Miller, it was a moment of profound significance. This was the culmination of countless hours of work, of whispers of hope and agonizing dead ends. For Adam, it was the tangible manifestation of his abstract genealogical charts, the physical reality of a cold case finally confronting its past. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the casket was carefully, respectfully brought to the surface. It was a simple wooden box, remarkably well preserved given the passage of time. A hush fell over the small group as the lid was unsealed. The medical examiner, methodical and precise, worked quickly. A bone sample, specifically chosen for its high concentration of viable DNA, was carefully collected. Every precaution was taken to avoid contamination, every step documented meticulously. This single, small sample held the power to confirm or refute everything Adam's painstaking work had suggested. It was the definitive link, the irrefutable evidence that would either solidify Jonathan Miller's place in history as Emily Brown's killer or send the investigation spiraling back into the frustrating abyss of the unknown. The sample was immediately secured and transported under escort to the State Forensic Laboratory. The wait began again, this time far more agonizing than the initial DNA analysis. Every hour stretched into an eternity. The tension in the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department was palpable. Detective Miller, despite her professional resolve, found herself constantly checking her watch, her mind replaying every detail of the exhumation, every conversation with Adam. She understood the immense emotional stakes involved, not just for Emily's long-suffering family, but for the entire community of Willow Creek, which had lived under the shadow of this unsolved crime for far too long. Days later, the call finally came. It was the lab director, her voice clear and precise. Detective Miller took the call in her office. The door closed, Adam waiting anxiously just outside. The report was concise, leaving no room for doubt. The DNA profile extracted from the bone sample of Jonathan Miller was a perfect, unequivocal match to the unknown male DNA profile found on Emily Brown's clothing, a 100% match. The words resonated in the quiet office, a thunderclap of truth shattering decades of silence. A wave of complex emotions washed over Detective Miller: relief, profound sadness, and a deep sense of accomplishment. It was an almost surreal moment, the culmination of a journey that began with a child's disappearance and ended with the posthumous identification of her killer. She opened her door, her eyes meeting Adam's. She didn't need to say anything. The look on her face, a mixture of triumph and sorrow, conveyed everything. Adam felt a similar surge of relief coupled with a chilling realization of the monstrous truth he had unearthed. The scientific proof was irrefutable. Jonathan Miller, a seemingly ordinary man, was Emily Brown's killer. The news was swiftly communicated to Emily's family. Decades of agonizing uncertainty, of endless what-ifs and unanswered prayers, finally came to an end. The initial reaction was a complicated tapestry of emotions, tears of grief for the brutal loss, but also tears of profound, overwhelming relief. The monster had a name. The ghost that had haunted their lives for so long finally had a face, even if that face belonged to a man long dead. There was no longer a question of who. The truth, agonizing as it was, had finally set them free from the torment of the unknown. For Willow Creek, the news brought a somber sense of closure, a long-awaited answer to a question that had weighed on the town's collective soul for generations. The silence had finally been broken by the irrefutable voice of science. The confirmation of Jonathan Miller as Emily Brown's killer, while bringing a measure of grim satisfaction, immediately pivoted the investigation into a new, deeper phase. The who had been answered, but the why lingered, a haunting echo of the past. Why Emily? Why that morning? What drove a seemingly ordinary man to commit such a monstrous act? Detective Miller knew that understanding the motive, even for a deceased perpetrator, was crucial for providing true closure to Emily's family and for understanding the broader implications of the crime. The police department, now energized by the breakthrough, launched a comprehensive deep dive into Jonathan Miller's life. They revisited his past with a different lens, meticulously sifting through every piece of information that had been overlooked or dismissed in the initial pre-DNA investigation. Detectives spoke again with former neighbors, long-retired colleagues, distant relatives, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Jonathan during the 1970s. This time, their questions were more pointed, informed by the terrifying knowledge of his guilt. They sought out any hint of a hidden darkness, any suppressed memory, any detail that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but now held the key to his monstrous act. One of the most immediate avenues of inquiry was his history of minor infractions that Adam had unearthed. While public intoxication and disorderly conduct seemed trivial in the face of murder, they often pointed to deeper underlying issues. Interviews with his surviving adult children, though painful for them, slowly began to reveal a more complex and troubling portrait of their father. They spoke of a man prone to unpredictable mood swings, particularly when he had been drinking. There were hushed recollections of sudden bursts of anger, of a temper that flared quickly and often without clear provocation. These were details they had largely suppressed, dismissed as dad just being dad, or attributed to the stresses of life. But now, viewed through the chilling prism of Emily's murder, they took on a terrifying new significance. A former colleague from Willow Creek Auto, a man now in his 70s, vividly remembered Jonathan's behavior in the days leading up to Emily's murder. He recalled Jonathan being unusually withdrawn, sullen, and prone to angry outbursts after the temporary layoff was announced. He took it real hard, the old mechanic recalled, his voice raspy with memory. Said he felt like a failure, couldn't provide for his family. He'd spend his days just lurking around, seemed like. Not really doing anything, just watching. The witness also remembered Jonathan drinking heavily during that period, even for a man who generally enjoyed his alcohol. This detail painted a picture of a man spiraling, perhaps feeling emasculated by his sudden unemployment, his internal frustrations festering. The proximity of the auto shop to Emily's route, combined with his sudden idleness and volatile state, now clicked into place with chilling precision. Investigators also began to scour old police records for any other cold cases in the region that might bear a similar signature, looking for patterns of violence, particularly against children, that might have gone unsolved. The horrifying possibility that Emily was not Jonathan Miller's only victim began to surface. While no direct matches immediately jumped out, the police began cross-referencing geographical locations and time frames, a laborious but necessary task that could uncover a wider trail of devastation. The motive, while still shrouded in the specifics of Jonathan's internal state, began to coalesce around a disturbed psychology exacerbated by personal frustrations and the influence of alcohol. It was not a grand, elaborate scheme, but a tragic convergence of opportunity, a vulnerable victim, and a perpetrator whose inhibitions were likely lowered by anger and drink. The simple, brutal truth was often the hardest to accept. Sometimes evil emerges from the mundane, from unmanaged personal demons, from a flicker of opportunity taken in a moment of warped judgment. As the picture of Jonathan Miller darkened, another disquieting layer began to unfold. Whispers and vague recollections from long-term Willow Creek residents hinted at a broader culture of silence that had perhaps inadvertently protected Jonathan Miller in the past. An elderly woman who had lived on the same street as Jonathan for decades nervously recalled a time in the early 1970s when her own young daughter had been approached by a strange man near the local park. The girl had described him as creepy and had run home, frightened but unharmed. The mother had called the police, but the report, if it was ever formally filed, seemed to have gone nowhere. The man, she now realized with a jolt of terror, bore a striking resemblance to a younger Jonathan Miller. Why had nothing come of it then? Why hadn't this incident, or others like it, been followed up more aggressively? This led to an uncomfortable question. Had Jonathan Miller exhibited concerning behavior before, perhaps even preyed on others, but somehow managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system due to insufficient evidence or perhaps a reluctance to fully investigate uncomfortable truths within a small, tight-knit community? The deeper the investigation went into Jonathan's past, the more it became clear that while his culpability in Emily's murder was now definitively established, the circumstances that allowed him to remain hidden for so long, and whether there were other victims, remained chillingly unresolved questions. The truth about Emily's killer had finally emerged, but it also opened a disturbing Pandora's box, hinting at a wider, more unsettling narrative of overlooked warning signs and unaddressed dangers. The pursuit of full justice, it seemed, was far from over. The definitive identification of Jonathan Miller as Emily Brown's killer brought a profound, if somber, form of closure. Yet, as the initial shock subsided, a new unsettling question began to emerge, not about the killer's identity, but about the circumstances that had allowed him to remain hidden for so long. If Jonathan Miller was capable of such an act, had there been other warnings, other victims? And why had the original investigation, despite its best efforts, failed to connect the dots? The truth about Emily's murder had emerged from the grave, but it also cast a harsh light on the past, revealing shadows that had long been ignored. Detective Miller, now leading a cold case team that included Adam in a consulting capacity, turned her attention to these disquieting questions. They began by meticulously re-examining every police report, every interview transcript, and every piece of community information collected in Willow Creek in the years leading up to and immediately following Emily's death. The goal was to uncover any overlooked or dismissed incidents that, in hindsight, might have pointed to Jonathan Miller. One particular archive, dusty and forgotten, contained a series of minor incident reports from the Willow Creek Police Department dating back to the early 1970s. Most were mundane, lost pets, noise complaints, minor vandalism. But one report dated summer 1974, just a year before Emily's murder, sent a chill down Detective Miller's spine. It detailed a suspicious person incident. A 9-year-old girl walking home from a friend's house just a few blocks from Emily's had reported being followed and briefly grabbed by an unknown man. She had managed to break free and run home, terrified but unharmed. Her description of the assailant was vague. a man with dark hair around average height, driving an older, dark-colored sedan. The report noted that officers had patrolled the area but found no one, and the case was subsequently closed due to lack of leads. Now, with Jonathan Miller's identity and known presence in the area, this old report screamed with relevance. Jonathan owned an older, dark-colored sedan at the time. He fit the vague physical description. Could this have been him? Was this a precursor, a chilling, unheeded warning that a predator was lurking in Willow Creek? The possibility was sickening. Detective Miller sought out the woman who had been that 9-year-old girl. Now, in her early 50s, she was visibly shaken by the renewed inquiry. She remembered the fear, the distinct impression of danger, but her memories of the man's face were still hazy after so many years. Yet, when shown a photograph of Jonathan Miller from the 1970s, a flicker of recognition, a primal shiver, passed through her. It could have been him, she whispered, her voice tinged with a new, horrifying understanding of what she might have escaped. The investigation also revisited the rumors and whispers that had circulated in Willow Creek following Emily's murder. In small towns, information travels not just through official channels, but through hushed conversations, speculative gossip, and shared anxieties. There had been vague rumors of a creepy man who sometimes hung around the local park or loitered near the school. Some residents had dismissed them as urban legends, others as the paranoia that often accompanies tragedy. But a few, now emboldened by the truth of Jonathan Miller's guilt, came forward with more specific, though unverified, accounts. An elderly crossing guard recalled seeing Jonathan's car parked suspiciously near a bus stop on several occasions. A former bartender mentioned Jonathan's aggressive behavior towards women when drunk, though no official complaints had ever been filed. These anecdotes, dismissed as insignificant decades ago, now painted a clearer picture of a man with disturbing tendencies that were perhaps known or at least suspected by a segment of the community, but never acted upon or fully investigated. Why the silence? Why the lack of follow-up on these potential warning signs? The answers were complex and multifaceted. In 1975, the public's understanding of serial offenders and the psychology behind such crimes was far less sophisticated. There was less public awareness of the insidious nature of predatory behavior. Furthermore, small communities, while outwardly idyllic, often harbored an unspoken code of silence, a reluctance to openly discuss or report on the darker aspects of their neighbors' lives. Particularly if it involved someone with roots in the town, there was a desire to maintain the illusion of safety, to avoid casting suspicion on one of their own. Fear, too, played a significant role. If a predator was indeed among them, pointing fingers could be dangerous, and, perhaps most unsettlingly, there was the human tendency to rationalize away disturbing behavior, to believe it couldn't happen here, or that it was just a misunderstanding. The absence of sophisticated DNA technology in the 1970s also played a crucial part. Without that powerful scientific link, investigators relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, direct evidence, and confessions, elements that were simply not present in Emily's case. Jonathan Miller was a master of evasion, a shadow, and without a definitive forensic trail, he simply blended back into the community. The discovery of Jonathan Miller's culpability was a triumph for justice, but it also served as a painful reminder of the blind spots of the past. It forced Willow Creek to confront not just the actions of a single monster, but also the collective silence and the missed opportunities that had allowed him to remain hidden for so long. The case of Emily Brown was finally closed, but its revelations opened a new, unsettling investigation into the hidden currents of a town's history and the quiet, often unspoken complicity that allows evil to fester in plain sight. The echo of Emily's tragedy now carried a powerful, if painful, new message: the cost of silence. The official announcement from the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department, confirming Jonathan Miller as the killer of Emily Brown, sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet confines of the town. Decades of silence were shattered by the undeniable truth. echoing through national news headlines and social media. The story of a 7-year-old girl's murder, finally solved after 43 years, all thanks to the unprecedented application of genetic genealogy and the relentless dedication of a young student, captivated the nation. For Emily's family, the public declaration was a bittersweet symphony of relief and enduring sorrow. The initial raw grief had, over the decades, evolved into a dull, constant ache of unanswered questions. Now there was a name, a face, a semblance of an explanation for the horror that had ripped their lives apart. Emily's parents, now elderly and frail, received the news in a private meeting with Detective Miller and Adam. The emotions that washed over them were complex. Tears for the child they lost, tears for the decades of torment, but also a profound sense of peace. The monster was identified, and though long dead, the truth had finally prevailed. It allowed them, for the first time in over 4 decades, to truly begin the process of mourning not just Emily's death, but the stolen future she never had. They spoke quietly of Emily's infectious laugh, her love for butterflies, her innocent dreams. For years, their memories of her had been overshadowed by the grim mystery of her fate. Now, those brighter memories could finally shine through. The press conference held by the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department was packed. Detective Miller, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the emotional toll of the case, laid out the full narrative, the original investigation's struggles, the cold case revival, the groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy, and the painstaking work of Adam Greenwood. Adam, standing shyly beside her, became an overnight sensation, the unassuming student whose passion for family history had inadvertently led him to unravel a horrific crime, found himself thrust into the national spotlight. He spoke humbly of his dedication, emphasizing the power of new technologies and the importance of never giving up on justice. His story resonated deeply, inspiring countless discussions about the potential of citizen scientists and the evolving landscape of criminal investigations. For the community of Willow Creek, the revelation brought a mixture of grim satisfaction and an unsettling introspection. There was relief that the unknown threat had finally been identified, even if it had been one of their own. But there was also a pervasive sense of collective guilt, a quiet acknowledgement of the whispers ignored, the suspicious behaviors rationalized away in the pursuit of maintaining a peaceful facade. The town began to openly discuss the culture of silence that had perhaps allowed Jonathan Miller to operate, and potentially to inflict harm on others before Emily. It was an uncomfortable but necessary conversation, forcing them to confront the darker undercurrents of their own history. Emily Brown, once a tragic statistic, became a powerful symbol. Her case, now a national example of a cold case solved by revolutionary methods, spurred renewed interest and funding for other cold case units across the country. Law enforcement agencies began to actively explore partnerships with genetic genealogists, recognizing the invaluable role they could play in unraveling decades-old mysteries. Adam Greenwood himself was lauded, not just for his specific role in Emily's case, but for demonstrating the immense potential of his field. He continued his studies, now with an even clearer sense of purpose, dedicating his time to assisting other cold case investigations, his quiet expertise bringing hope to countless grieving families. Though Jonathan Miller had died without ever facing earthly justice for his heinous crime, the truth of his actions had finally been laid bare. Emily Brown's name, once a symbol of an unsolved tragedy, now became a testament to perseverance and the enduring power of truth. Her memory, freed from the suffocating grip of mystery, could finally rest. The small, weathered headstone in Willow Creek Cemetery, marking the grave of Jonathan Miller, now bore an invisible stain, forever linked to the innocent life he had brutally taken. And for Emily, though decades late, the simple, undeniable triumph of truth finally ensured that she was more than just a name in a cold case file. She was the reason why, for countless other victims, the shadows of the past might finally dissipate, bringing long-awaited justice to light.